The wind howls like a wounded animal outside my window as I write this. I need to document what happened at Station Vostok before I forget who I am, before what's left of me disappears completely. My name is Dr. Owen Carter. I've been the lead researcher at this remote Alaskan outpost for nearly 8 years now. The station sits perched on the edge of the Bering Sea, a small cluster of buildings clinging to the frozen coastline like barnacles on a whale. Our mission has always been straightforward. Monitor marine activity, track ice shelf movements, collect data, simple, scientific work. There were 6 of us here, rotating out every 6 months. We had only 3 weeks left in our current rotation when it happened, when that ship appeared. I remember standing in the observation deck that morning, coffee warming my hands through the ceramic mug. The visibility was unusually good, the gray light of dawn illuminating the endless white landscape and the dark, churning waters beyond. Jonah Vasquez, our communications specialist and resident fix-it guy, was tinkering with one of the radar panels. Getting some weird feedback from the coastal scan, he muttered, not looking up from his work. Probably just ice buildup on the sensors again. I moved to look over his shoulder. Show me. He pointed to a large, oblong shape on the display. See that? Too big for wildlife, too still for a normal vessel. I squinted at the screen. How long has it been there? That's the thing, Jonah said, finally looking up at me. His dark eyes reflected the green glow of the monitor. It wasn't there when I ran the scan at midnight. Whatever this is, it just appeared. I remember feeling that first chill that had nothing to do with the freezing temperatures outside. By the time we'd assembled the rest of the team in the control room, the object had moved closer to our harbor. Dr. Evelyn Park, our virologist, peered through the high-powered binoculars, her breath creating small clouds against the frigid glass of the window. It's a ship, she said finally, handing me the binoculars. A big one. Looks like a freighter, but there's no flag, no markings I can see. Through the lenses, I could make out the massive hull encrusted with ice. Even from this distance, something seemed off about it. Dark patches mottled its surface, almost like bruises on skin. No distress signals, I asked, turning to Jonah. He shook his head. Nothing, no radio contact, no identification transponder, it's just drifting. Lena Morozov, our oceanographer, was already pulling up maritime traffic records on her tablet. Her fingers moved across the screen with practiced efficiency, her brow furrowed in concentration. There's nothing scheduled in this sector, she said after a moment. No research vessels, no cargo ships, nothing. Mark Holloway, our security officer, stood with his arms crossed, his weathered face set in grim lines. We should call this in before doing anything else. Jonah grimaced. Slight problem with that. The weather service just upgraded the incoming system to a Category 5 storm. We've got maybe 36 hours before it hits, and when it does, we're cut off for at least 3 days. I looked back through the binoculars. The ship was moving with the current, slowly but surely being pulled toward our small harbor. If there's anyone alive on that thing, they won't survive the storm out there, I said finally. We need to investigate. Mark's frown deepened. With all due respect, Dr. Carter, it's not our job to play Coast Guard. We don't know what that ship is or where it came from. Exactly why we need to check it out, Lena interjected, her Russian accent becoming more pronounced as her excitement grew. This could be important. Caleb Wright, our research assistant, had been quiet until now. At 29, he was the youngest of our group, eager to prove himself. I'll go if you need volunteers, he offered, his voice steady despite the nervous tap of his fingers against his leg. In the end, I decided that Mark, Jonah, and I would make the initial assessment. We suited up in our cold weather gear, and I instructed Evelyn to prepare the quarantine protocols, just in case. Standard procedure for unknown vessels. Take sample kits, Evelyn insisted, handing them to me. If there's anything unusual, I want to analyze it. The trip to the ship was rough, our small motorboat fighting against the increasingly choppy waters. As we approached, the vessel loomed above us, a dark mountain against the pale sky. Up close, the discoloration was more evident, strange, almost organic patterns spreading across the hull like veins. "What the hell happened to this thing?" Jonah muttered, his voice nearly lost in the wind. Mark was scanning the deck with his binoculars. No movement, no signs of life. We circled once before finding a way to board, a cargo ladder hanging down the starboard side, half encased in ice. The climb was treacherous, the metal rungs biting cold even through our gloves. I went first, then Jonah, with Mark bringing up the rear. The main deck was a scene from a nightmare. Dark stains, unmistakably blood, streaked across the frosted metal, leading toward the superstructure. More disturbing were the gouges in the steel deck plates and bulkheads, deep, curved marks that no human tool could have made. "Jesus Christ," Mark whispered, his hand instinctively moving to the pistol at his side. "Doc," Jonah called from a few yards away, "you need to see this." He was standing over what I first thought was a pile of torn clothing. As I drew closer, I realized it was a body, or what remained of one. The corpse was contorted in a way that defied anatomy, the limbs bent at impossible angles, the flesh sunken and discolored. The face was frozen in an expression of pure terror, the mouth stretched open as if in mid-scream. "We need to call the mainland," Mark said immediately. "This is a crime scene." I knelt beside the body, my scientific curiosity momentarily overriding my horror. "Look at the tissue degradation. This isn't normal decomposition." "Normal? None of this is normal," Mark snapped. "We need to go, now. We need to check for survivors first," I insisted. "And we need to figure out what happened here." Our radios crackled with static as Evelyn's voice broke through. "Owen, do you copy? What's happening out there?" "We've found one casualty," I reported. "No signs of survivors yet. There's, evidence of violence. We're going to check below decks." I could almost hear her frown. "Be careful. If there's any biohazard risk, you need to follow full containment procedures." The entrance to the ship's interior was just ahead, a heavy metal door hanging ajar. Inside was darkness, broken only by the beams of our flashlights. The air was noticeably warmer than outside, but stale, with an underlying scent I couldn't place, something like rotting meat mixed with a metallic tang. "The power's out," Jonah observed, playing his light over dead control panels and darkened emergency lights. "Let's make this quick," Mark said. "Engine room and crew quarters. If there's anyone alive, that's where they'll be." We moved deeper into the vessel, our footsteps echoing on the metal walkways. The corridors were narrow, the walls lined with pipes and electrical conduits. More blood trails marked our path, some leading forward, others disappearing into side passages. The radio connection grew worse the deeper we went, Evelyn's voice breaking up into fragments. "Losing your signal, shouldn't, too long." As we approached what looked like the crew quarters, the temperature continued to rise, becoming uncomfortably warm given our cold weather gear. The corridor ahead was blocked by a partially collapsed bulkhead, forcing us to squeeze through one at a time. On the other side, we found more bodies, 3 of them, arranged in a grotesque tableau. Unlike the first, these showed signs of transformation. The skin had a waxy, melted appearance, and in places seemed fused with what looked like black fungal growths. One corpse had an arm that terminated, not in a hand, but in a twisted mass of tendrils. "What the hell could do this?" Jonah whispered, his voice shaking. Mark's face had gone pale. "We're leaving, right now." I was about to agree when Caleb's voice suddenly came through our radios, the unexpected sound making us all jump. "Dr. Carter, it's Caleb. Lena and I decided to come aboard. We've found something in the cargo hold you need to see." Mark swore under his breath. Right, you're not authorized to be on this vessel. Where are you exactly?" The only response was static. "They must have followed us," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "We need to find them and get everyone off this ship." We backtracked to the main corridor and found signs that someone had passed through recently, boot prints in the dust that hadn't been there before. We followed them down, past the crew mess, and toward the cargo areas. The cargo hold door was massive, designed to seal off the largest part of the ship in case of emergency. It stood partially open, a black gap just wide enough for a person to slip through. The metal around the opening was deformed, huge dents pushing outward, as if something inside had been trying to get out with tremendous force. And through that gap came a soft, pulsing light with a sickly green tint. "Caleb," I called out. "Lena, are you in there?" No response. Mark moved forward, his gun now drawn. "I'm going to check it out. You two stay here." "We stick together," I insisted. The three of us squeezed through the gap one by one. The cargo hold was cavernous, most of it lost in darkness. Our flashlight beams seemed swallowed by the vast space. The source of the pulsing light was immediately apparent, a large, glistening mass attached to the far wall. It resembled nothing so much as an enormous fungal growth, but it moved with a sickening rhythm like a beating heart. And standing before it, their backs to us, were Caleb and Lena. "What are you two doing here?" I demanded. "This isn't safe. We need to leave immediately." They turned slowly, in perfect unison. Lena's face was blank, her normally expressive eyes dull. "We heard it calling, Dr. Carter," she said, her voice flat. "It wants to show us something." Caleb nodded, a strange smile playing on his lips. "It's beautiful, isn't it? The perfect organism." Mark raised his weapon. "Step away from that thing, now." Jonah had moved to one side, his flashlight illuminating more of the hold. "Oh God," he breathed. "There are more bodies." I followed his light to see dozens of corpses arranged in a rough circle around the pulsating mass. Some were clearly from the ship's crew, still in tattered uniforms. Others wore civilian clothes, and a few were dressed in what looked like research gear. Caleb's head tilted at an unnatural angle. "They weren't compatible. We are." That's when I noticed the black veins spreading up his neck from beneath his collar. "Run," Mark shouted, firing a shot that went wide as Lena suddenly lunged at him with inhuman speed. I grabbed Jonah's arm and pulled him toward the exit as Mark struggled with Lena, whose body was beginning to change, her jacket splitting as her arms elongated into something no longer recognizable as human. We barely made it through the door. Jonah helped me force it shut, trapping Mark inside with the things that had been our colleagues moments before. His screams cut off abruptly as the door sealed with a heavy clang. "We have to help him," Jonah gasped, already reaching for the door again. I pulled him back. "That's not Mark anymore. Listen." From behind the door came a wet, sliding sound, punctuated by a low, multi-tone moan that no human throat could produce. We ran, through corridors that suddenly seemed unfamiliar, up staircases that felt endless, the sounds of pursuit always just behind us. When we finally burst onto the deck, the gray daylight felt like a blessing. We didn't hesitate, practically throwing ourselves down the cargo ladder to the waiting boat. As we sped away, I looked back at the ship. 3 figures stood at the railing, watching us, Mark, Lena, and Caleb, or things wearing their shapes. They didn't move, didn't try to call out, they just watched. When we reached the station, Evelyn was waiting at the dock, her face tight with worry. "Where are the others?" she asked, helping us secure the boat. I couldn't find the words to explain. Jonah just shook his head, his hands trembling so badly he could barely tie the mooring line. Back inside the station, I finally managed to tell Evelyn what we'd seen. To her credit, she didn't dismiss our story, didn't suggest we were suffering from cold-induced hallucinations or mass hysteria. Instead, she immediately went into containment mode, insisting we shower and change into fresh clothes while she prepared the lab to examine us. "If there's any kind of pathogen or parasite, we need to know," she said, already pulling on her protective gear. "Whatever you saw in that cargo hold could be biological in nature." "It wasn't just biological," Jonah argued, his voice still shaky. "You didn't see how they moved, how they changed. This is something else." The examination revealed nothing immediately concerning. No unusual marks, no signs of infection. Evelyn took blood samples from both of us, along with skin scrapings and mucous membrane swabs. "I'll run every test I can," she promised. "In the meantime, we should try to contact the mainland before the storm hits." Jonah returned to the communications room while Evelyn worked in the lab. I stayed with her, unable to shake the image of that pulsating mass from my mind. What if it's not terrestrial? I asked finally. Evelyn looked up from her microscope. You mean extraterrestrial? That's quite a leap, Owen. Is it? What else could explain what we saw? She sighed, pushing away from the lab bench. There are plenty of terrestrial organisms that can manipulate host behavior. Cordyceps fungi, parasitic worms, certain protozoans. Nature has been perfecting mind control long before we came along. Before I could respond, the station's emergency alarm began to blare. We rushed to the control room to find Jonah standing rigidly by the radar display. The storm front has accelerated, he said without looking up. It'll hit in less than 6 hours. And there's something else. He pointed to the screen. The ship is moving. I leaned in for a closer look. The vessel was indeed changing position, but not in the random drift pattern of an abandoned ship. It was turning, deliberately, to point straight at our station. That's impossible, Evelyn whispered. There's no one left to pilot it. There's someone, I corrected. Just not someone human anymore. The next few hours were a blur of activity. We secured the station for the storm, welded shut every external access point except the main entrance, and set up a defensive perimeter with the limited weapons we had available, mostly flare guns and a few hunting rifles kept for emergencies. All the while, the radar showed the ship moving steadily closer. I can't raise anyone on the emergency channel, Jonah reported, frustration evident in his voice. The storm's already interfering with long-range communications. Night fell early, as it always does in the Alaskan winter. The wind picked up, howling around the station's structure with increasing fury. Snow began to fall, reducing visibility to nearly zero. And that's when the power went out. The emergency generators kicked in after a few seconds, but the momentary darkness was enough to send my heart racing. Evelyn appeared at my side, her face illuminated by the red emergency lighting. I found something in our blood work, she said quietly. Microscopic structures I can't identify. They're not showing any activity, but they're there, in both of you. I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach. Am I infected? I don't know, these structures aren't like any pathogen I've ever seen. They almost look dormant. A crash from outside interrupted our conversation. We rushed to the observation window to see a dark figure struggling through the snow toward the station. It moved awkwardly, lurching forward against the wind. Is that? Evelyn began. Caleb, I finished. But it can't be. Jonah had joined us, his rifle raised. What do we do? I made a decision. We can't let it inside. Whatever it is, it's not Caleb anymore. The figure reached the main entrance and began pounding on the door. The sound echoed through the station, unnaturally loud even over the howling wind. Dr. Carter, it was Caleb's voice, desperate and frightened. Please, let me in. I escaped from the ship. I'm hurt. Jonah's rifle wavered. What if it really is him? What if he got away? It's not, Evelyn said firmly. We saw what happened to him. This is a trick. The pounding continued, growing more frantic. Please, they're coming. Let me in. I moved closer to the window, trying to see past the swirling snow, and then I saw them. More shapes moving in the darkness, approaching the station from the direction of the harbor. There are more of them, I warned. At least 3, maybe 4. The thing wearing Caleb's face suddenly stopped pounding and stepped back from the door. It looked up, directly at our window, and smiled. Even through the snow and darkness, I could see that smile was too wide, stretching beyond the normal confines of a human face. It raised an arm and the limb elongated, stretching impossibly as it pointed toward the roof of the station. The ventilation system, Evelyn realized with horror. If they get in through the vents... A loud metallic groan from above confirmed our fears. Something was on the roof. We retreated to the interior of the station, sealing pressure doors behind us as we went. The emergency lighting cast everything in a bloody hue, shadows stretching like grasping fingers along the walls. We need a way to kill these things, Jonah said as we reached the central lab. Fire, chemicals. Evelyn was already at the supply cabinet, pulling out bottles. Extreme cold seems to slow them down. If we can supercool the ventilation system, it might buy us some time. I moved to help her but stopped as a strange sensation washed over me, a pulling, almost magnetic feeling in my mind. Owen, Evelyn was looking at me with concern. Are you alright? I shook my head to clear it. Fine, just thought I heard something. We worked quickly, preparing canisters of liquid nitrogen normally used for preserving samples. Jonah rigged them to release into the ventilation system on a timer. This won't stop them for long, Evelyn warned. But it might slow them down enough for us to figure out a more permanent solution. That's when we heard it, a soft thud from the direction of the sleeping quarters, followed by the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. They're inside, Jonah whispered, raising his rifle again. We moved silently toward the sound, through the darkened corridor that led to our personal rooms. The dragging had stopped, replaced by a wet, slithering noise. Jonah went first, his rifle at the ready. As he rounded the corner, he let out a strangled gasp and stumbled backward. Mark stood in the middle of the corridor, or something that had once been Mark. His body was distorted, his torso elongated and twisted. One arm had split into 3 writhing appendages while the other remained eerily normal. His face was still recognizably his, except for the eyes which had multiplied across his forehead in a row of glistening black orbs. Behind him lay the partially transformed body of Lena, her lower half now a mass of tentacles that pulsed and squirmed against the floor. "Hello, Owen," Mark's mouth said, though the voice was wrong, multiple tones layered on top of each other. "We've been waiting for you." Jonah fired twice, the shots deafeningly loud in the confined space. The bullets tore through Mark's chest, leaving gaping holes that immediately began to close, the flesh knitting back together before our eyes. "Run," I shouted, pulling Evelyn back the way we had come. We fled toward the communications room, hoping to barricade ourselves inside. As we ran, lights began to flicker and equipment sparked and died as we passed. The thing was affecting the station's electrical system somehow. We made it to the communications room and slammed the door shut behind us, Jonah shoving a heavy desk against it for good measure. Through the small window in the door, we could see nothing but darkness in the hallway beyond. "The emergency transponder," I gasped, trying to catch my breath. "If we can activate it, maybe someone will investigate when the storm clears." Jonah moved to the console, his fingers flying over the controls. "Power to this section is intermittent. I can try to reroute from the emergency batteries, but it'll take time." Evelyn had gone to the far wall, where a small window looked out over the harbor. "The ship," she said quietly. "It's at the dock now." I joined her at the window. Through gaps in the swirling snow, I could make out the looming shape of the vessel, now secured alongside our small dock. The sight filled me with dread. They planned this, I realized. They led us to the ship, infected us, and now they're taking over the station. "Not just the station," Evelyn said grimly. "Think about it, Owen. If this infection reaches the mainland." The implications were too horrifying to contemplate. Whatever this organism was, it could replace humans perfectly. It could spread undetected until it was too late. A soft thump against the door drew our attention, then another and another, a rhythmic pounding that wasn't trying to break through but rather announcing its presence. "We know you're afraid," came a chorus of voices from the other side, Mark, Lena, and Caleb speaking in perfect unison. "But there's no need to be. Joining us is transcendent." I felt that strange pulling in my mind again, stronger now. Beside me, Jonah swayed slightly, his eyes unfocused. "Don't listen to them," Evelyn hissed, gripping my arm. "They're trying to influence us somehow." The pounding stopped. "We're already inside you, Owen," the voices continued. "You've been carrying us since you first set foot on our ship. The changes have already begun." I looked down at my hands, half expecting to see them transforming. They looked normal, but there was a strange sensation beneath the skin, like something moving. Evelyn saw my expression and her face hardened with resolve. "We can't let this spread," she said. "You know what we have to do." I did know. The station had protocols for catastrophic containment breaches, a last resort never meant to be used. The research reactor that powered our facility could be overloaded, triggering an explosion that would destroy the entire outpost. "Jonah," I said, turning to him, "can you access the reactor controls from here?" He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yes, but Owen, that would kill us all." We're already dead, I told him, the certainty of it settling over me like a shroud. The only question is whether we die as ourselves or as those things. The decision made, we worked quickly. Jonah broke through the security protocols on the reactor control system while Evelyn and I gathered whatever weapons and supplies we could find in the communications room. The overload will take about 15 minutes to reach critical mass, Jonah explained. Once I initiate the sequence, we can't stop it. Do it, I ordered. He took a deep breath and entered the final command. A warning klaxon immediately began to sound throughout the station. They'll know what we're doing, Evelyn warned. They'll try to stop us. As if in response, the pounding on the door resumed, harder now, the metal beginning to dent inward under the force. The desk blocking it slid across the floor an inch, then another. We need to split up, I decided. Make them divide their forces. Jonah, take the emergency flares from the survival kit. Anything you can use to hold them off. He nodded grimly, loading a flare gun with steady hands. What's the plan? We keep them busy until the reactor goes critical. No matter what happens, we don't let them stop the overload. The door buckled further, the hinges beginning to tear from the wall. Now, I shouted, and we shoved the desk aside and yanked open the door, catching the creatures on the other side by surprise. Jonah fired a flare directly into what had been Mark's face, the magnesium burning bright enough to momentarily blind me. The creature shrieked, a sound no human vocal cords could produce, as its flesh sizzled and smoked. We pushed past them, Jonah going left toward the labs, Evelyn and I heading right toward the reactor control room. Behind us, the things that had been our colleagues regrouped and split up in pursuit. Evelyn and I had almost reached the reactor level when a slithering mass dropped from a ventilation duct ahead of us. Lena, or what remained of her. Her body had continued to transform, now little more than a writhing collection of tendrils surrounding a core that still bore her face. You can't stop evolution, Owen, she said, her voice eerily normal despite her monstrous form. We are the future. Evelyn raised the axe we'd grabbed from an emergency station, her face set in grim determination. Go, she told me. I'll hold it here. I hesitated, unwilling to leave her. Evelyn. Go, she shouted, already swinging the axe at a tendril that had snaked toward her. Make sure this ends here. I ran, the sounds of combat fading behind me as I descended the final stairwell to the reactor level. The warning klaxon was louder here, the emergency lights flashing in sync with the alarm. According to the station's schematic displayed on the wall panel, I had less than 8 minutes before critical mass. The reactor control room was unmanned, the overload sequence already initiated. The temperature in the chamber was rising rapidly, warning indicators flashing red across every monitor. I sealed the door behind me and moved to the main console, checking that the sequence couldn't be interrupted remotely. A soft noise from the corner of the room made me freeze. Slowly, I turned to find Caleb sitting on the floor, his back against the wall. He looked entirely normal. No visible transformations, no extra eyes or twisted limbs. Just Caleb, scared and human. Dr. Carter, he said, his voice breaking. Help me, please. I've been fighting it, but I can't hold on much longer. I approached cautiously, keeping the console between us. Caleb, is that really you? He nodded, tears streaming down his face. It's still me for now, but it's inside me, changing me. I can feel it. He lifted his shirt to reveal black veins spreading across his chest, pulsing beneath the skin. I don't want to become one of them. Despite everything, I felt pity stir within me. I'm sorry, Caleb. I truly am, but there's nothing I can do. His expression shifted, hardened. Then let me help you. You're infected too, you know. I can see it beginning. Let me show you how to fight it. He extended his hand toward me, and for a moment, just a moment, I considered taking it. Then I saw the subtle elongation of his fingers, the way the joints bent at slightly wrong angles. No, I said, stepping back. You're not Caleb anymore. His face twisted into a snarl, all pretense of humanity falling away. Then you'll join us the hard way. He lunged, faster than any human could move, his arms extending grotesquely as he cleared the console separating us. I barely had time to react, grabbing a fire extinguisher from the wall and swinging it with all my strength. The metal cylinder connected with his head with a sickening crunch, but he didn't fall. Instead, his neck elongated, the crushed skull reforming even as I watched in horror. His mouth split open, widening until it seemed to bisect his entire face, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. I discharged the extinguisher directly into that monstrous maw, the freezing foam causing the creature to shriek and recoil. I used the momentary advantage to dash for the emergency containment door, a reinforced barrier designed to isolate the reactor chamber in case of radiation leaks. The thing that had been Caleb recovered quickly, moving between me and the exit with unnatural speed. "There's nowhere to go, Owen," it hissed. "The storm rages outside. The ship waits at the dock. Your friends are already becoming like us. Why continue to resist?" I glanced at the reactor monitoring screen. 4 minutes until critical mass. I just needed to keep it occupied for 4 more minutes. "What are you?" I demanded, trying to buy time. "Where did you come from?" The creature tilted its head, an eerily human gesture from its increasingly inhuman form. "We are ancient. We have existed in the cold dark between stars. We have drifted through the void for eons, waiting for a suitable host species." It smiled, that too wide grin stretching across its face. "And now we found you." The ship, I realized. It found the ship first. "A research vessel," it confirmed. "They discovered our dormant form in the ice. They brought us aboard to study. They did not understand what they had found until it was too late." The room was growing unbearably hot now, sweat pouring down my face as the reactor approached meltdown. The creature seemed unconcerned by the heat, by the warning klaxons, by the imminent destruction. "You cannot stop us with this gesture, Owen. Even if you destroy this outpost, some of us will survive. The cold only forces us into dormancy, and there will be other ships, other curious humans." I backed away until I felt the heat of the reactor housing against my back. The metal was burning hot, even through my clothes. 3 minutes. The creature moved closer, its form shifting and flowing like liquid, Caleb's features melting away into something utterly alien. "Join us willingly. It will be less painful." That's when the door behind it burst open, and Evelyn staggered in, covered in blood, some of it red and human, some of it black and other. She was clutching her side, where a deep wound oozed dark fluid mixed with her own blood. "Owen," she gasped, "the reactor." The creature whirled to face this new threat, momentarily forgetting about me. It was the opportunity I needed. I lunged for the emergency containment controls, slamming my hand down on the isolation button. Thick, reinforced barriers began to descend from the ceiling, one separating me from both Evelyn and the creature, another cutting off the control room from the rest of the station. The creature realized what was happening too late, throwing itself against the barrier as it sealed shut with a pneumatic hiss. I was now trapped in the reactor chamber, alone, with less than 2 minutes until critical mass. Through the small reinforced window in the barrier, I could see Evelyn backing away from the creature as it turned its full attention to her. It was changing again, growing larger, its limbs splitting and multiplying as it advanced. Evelyn looked past it, her eyes meeting mine through the window. She mouthed something I couldn't hear over the alarms, but I understood nonetheless. "I'm sorry." Then she pulled something from her pocket, a small device I recognized as a portable detonator. Before the creature could reach her, she pressed the trigger. The explosion ripped through the control room, the reinforced barrier barely containing the blast. The creature was caught in the center of it, its body torn apart by the force. Evelyn, I knew, had been killed instantly. Alone in the reactor chamber, I slid down against the overheating housing, my legs no longer able to support me. The countdown on the monitor showed less than a minute remaining. The temperature was now well beyond what human flesh could tolerate, my skin blistering, my lungs burning with each breath. And yet, oddly, I felt a strange sense of calm. I thought of Evelyn's sacrifice, of Jonah's courage. I wondered if Jonah had managed to hold off the other creatures, if he was still himself in these final moments. I hoped so. As the countdown reached its final seconds, I closed my eyes. I could feel something stirring beneath my skin, something trying to take control, to change me from within. But it was too late. The heat was too intense, the meltdown too close. "You lose," I whispered to whatever was inside me. The world turned white. I don't remember the explosion. I don't remember how I survived. I only know that I woke up in the snow, my body broken but somehow alive, surrounded by the smoldering ruins of Station Vostok. The storm had passed. The sky was clear, stars glittering in the cold darkness above. In the distance, I could see the ship, undamaged by the explosion that had leveled our outpost. It sat motionless at the dock, a dark sentinel against the white landscape. I tried to move and found that I could, though every motion sent waves of agony through my body. My clothes were in tatters, my skin a patchwork of burns and frostbite. How long had I been unconscious in the snow? Hours, days. With tremendous effort, I managed to drag myself toward what remained of our storage shed, the only structure still partially standing. Inside, I found emergency supplies, a thermal blanket, a first aid kit, a satellite phone. The latter was crushed, useless. As I bandaged the worst of my wounds, I became aware of a strange sensation throughout my body. Not pain, exactly, but a kind of movement beneath my skin. I pulled back the bandage on my arm to see the flesh rippling, as if something were swimming just below the surface. "No," I whispered, terror gripping me anew. "No, please." The thing inside me was still alive, still trying to complete its transformation, but something was wrong. It seemed to be struggling, fighting against itself. The heat of the reactor should have killed it. Why hadn't it died with the others? And then I realized the terrible truth. I wasn't just infected. I was changing, yes, but not like the others had. The organism was adapting to me as much as I was adapting to it. We were becoming something new, something in between. I staggered to my feet and looked toward the ship again. It called to me now, a siren song in my mind. I could feel others there, not quite like me but similar, waiting. With nowhere else to go, I began the long, painful journey across the snow. Each step was agony, but the pull was undeniable. By the time I reached the dock, the sun was rising, casting long purple shadows across the ice. The ship loomed above me, somehow more alive than before. The dark patterns across its hull pulsed with a rhythm that matched the movement beneath my skin. I knew, somehow, that the vessel itself was part of the organism, not just infested by it, but transformed into a new state of being. I climbed aboard with difficulty, my limbs no longer working quite as they should. The deck was empty, but I could sense presence all around me, watching, waiting. I made my way to the cargo hold, drawn inexorably to the pulsating mass I knew waited below. The hold was as I remembered it, but larger somehow, the growth having spread to cover nearly every surface. Bodies, dozens more than before, were half absorbed into the walls, their features still recognizable though no longer human. And in the center, a new form took shape. A towering column of twisted flesh and bone that reached from floor to ceiling. As I approached, it seemed to bend toward me, acknowledging my presence. "You survived," came a voice from behind me. I turned to find Mark, or what had once been Mark. His transformation had progressed further, his body now more alien than human, though his face remained recognizable. "The others didn't," I said, my voice rough from smoke and screaming. "They weren't compatible," Mark replied, moving closer. "Not like you. We've been waiting for someone like you, someone who could bridge the gap between your kind and ours." More figures emerged from the shadows, Lena, Caleb, and others I didn't recognize. All in various stages of transformation, all watching me with hungry anticipation. "What do you want from me?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "To complete what has begun," Mark said. "To become the perfect fusion, human intelligence with our adaptability, the ideal ambassador for when we reach the mainland." The mainland, civilization, millions of unsuspecting humans who would have no defense against what these things could do, what we could do. "And if I refuse?" I asked. Mark's too wide smile returned. "You already know the answer to that, Owen. You can feel it inside you. The change cannot be stopped now, only guided. The only choice remaining is whether you embrace it or fight it until the end." I looked down at my hands, watching as the skin rippled and shifted. The movement was stronger now, more purposeful. Soon I would lose whatever humanity I had left. But perhaps that was the key. Perhaps my humanity, the very thing these creatures sought to harness, could be their undoing. "You're right," I said finally. "I can feel it changing me, and I'm tired of fighting." Mark nodded, approving. Then come, join with the core, complete your transformation. He stepped aside, gesturing toward the massive growth at the center of the hold. I moved toward it, feeling its pull strengthen with every step. Behind me, the others followed, a procession of monstrosities eager to witness my rebirth. The surface of the growth pulsed as I approached, a section parting like lips to reveal a cavity within, a perfect cocoon shaped for a human body. My body. Step inside, Mark urged. Become our bridge to your world. I hesitated at the edge, looking back at the creatures that had once been my colleagues, my friends. Their eager, inhuman faces watched me, waiting. I just have one question, I said, turning back to the pulsating mass. When the reactor exploded, why didn't the heat kill the infection inside me? Mark tilted his head, curious. Heat is only deadly to us in our early stages. Once we've begun to bond with a host, we adapt, we evolve. The heat merely accelerated your particular transformation. I see, I said, nodding slowly, so fire alone isn't enough. Before any of them could react, I pulled the emergency flare I'd hidden beneath my tattered jacket and struck it against the growth. The magnesium flare blazed to life, brighter than the sun, and I plunged it deep into the organic mass. The reaction was immediate and catastrophic. The growth shrieked, a sound that existed somewhere between frequencies, piercing my skull like physical pain. The creatures behind me howled in unison, their bodies convulsing as the central mass began to burn. I staggered back, watching as the fire spread with unnatural speed. It wasn't just burning, it was consuming, devouring the alien tissue with an almost sentient hunger. The ship itself began to groan and shift as the fire spread through its transformed structure. "What have you done?" Mark screamed, his voice no longer remotely human. His body was melting, flesh sloughing off in burning sheets as the fire spread to him. "Evolved," I answered, feeling a savage triumph, even as the fire began to spread to my own infected flesh. "Adapted." My plan had been simple. The reactor's heat had changed the infection inside me, made it different from the others, and in doing so it had created a vulnerability. My infected tissue wasn't just burning, it was turning against its own kind, consuming them like an autoimmune response gone wild. The ship was burning now, black smoke pouring from every opening. The creatures that had been my friends were either dead or fleeing, their bodies dissolving as my altered infection spread to them. I could feel it burning inside me too, consuming the alien presence even as it consumed my human flesh. I knew I wouldn't survive, but neither would they. With the last of my strength, I made my way back to the deck as the ship began to list to one side. The fire had reached the fuel tanks, and secondary explosions rocked the vessel. I gazed out at the endless white landscape, at the beautiful desolation of Alaska stretching to the horizon. No one would know what happened here. No one would understand the sacrifice we had made, but they would be safe, at least from this particular horror. As the ship began to break apart beneath my feet, I closed my eyes and embraced the end. The fire inside me, the fire I had become, would ensure nothing survived. Not the aliens, not their ship, and not me. In my final moments, as consciousness slipped away, I thought I felt something cold brush against my mind. A vast, ancient intelligence touching mine one last time, not in anger or hunger, but in something almost like respect. Then there was only fire, and after that, darkness. I died on that ship, I know I did. So how am I writing this now? The truth is, I don't know if what's left of me is truly Owen Carter. The fire should have consumed everything, the ship, the organisms, me, yet somehow I woke up again, drifting in the Bering Sea on a makeshift raft of debris. A fishing vessel found me 3 days later. The crew described me as severely burned, barely alive, with no memory of who I was or how I'd ended up adrift. They said I healed with remarkable speed during the journey to the mainland. Too remarkable. Station Vostok was reported destroyed in a reactor meltdown. The authorities found no survivors, only charred ruins. No one knows about the ship. No one believes my story. But sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I see something move beneath my skin. Sometimes, when I sleep, I dream of the cold dark between stars, of ancient things drifting through endless void. And sometimes, I wonder if the fire didn't purge the infection but complete it, creating something entirely new. I watch the news for reports of strange ships appearing near isolated communities. I scan medical journals for accounts of unusual infections or inexplicable transformations. So far, nothing. But I remain vigilant. Because if there's one thing I learned from our encounter with the thing from that unmarked ship, it's that the most dangerous predators are those that can hide in plain sight. Those that can look human, act human, even believe they are human until the moment they aren't. I don't know if I'm still Owen Carter or something wearing his shape. I don't know if what's inside me is dormant or simply waiting, but I do know this. If you see an unmarked ship appear without warning, if you find yourself drawn to investigate something that should be left alone, remember my story, remember Station Vostok, and run while you still can. Because the cold dark between stars is vast, and what drifts through it is patient beyond human understanding, and it's still out there, waiting.